The morning sunlight filtered through my kitchen window as I carefully arranged fresh daisies in the crystal vase that had belonged to my grandmother. At 73, my hands weren't as steady as they once were, but I still took pride in making my home beautiful. The yellow petals reminded me of spring mornings when my late husband Robert would surprise me with wildflowers from our garden. Those days felt like a distant dream now, especially with what was about to unfold in my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had always believed that family was everything. After losing Robert to a heart attack 5 years ago, that belief became my lifeline. My son Marcus was all I had left in this world, and I had poured every ounce of love and support into maintaining our relationship. But sometimes love isn't enough, and sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who will hurt you deepest. What happened next would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family and force me to discover a strength I never knew I possessed. The trouble began 3 months after Marcus married Stephanie. I should have seen the warning signs earlier, but love has a way of making us blind to red flags. Stephanie was 28, 15 years younger than my 33-year-old son, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that some might call assertive and others might call entitled. She worked as a marketing coordinator at a tech startup downtown, always impeccably dressed in designer clothes that seemed expensive for someone in her position. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her nails always manicured, and she had a way of looking at you that made you feel like she was calculating your worth. I lived in the 2-story colonial house that Robert and I had bought when Marcus was just a baby. The mortgage had been paid off years ago, and the house sat on nearly an acre of beautifully landscaped property in one of the more desirable neighborhoods in town. It was worth considerably more now than when we'd purchased it, something that hadn't escaped Stephanie's notice during her first visit. I'd caught her taking photos of the crown molding and asking detailed questions about the property taxes and maintenance costs. At the time, I'd brushed it off as natural curiosity about her new family's history. Marcus had always been a good son, thoughtful and caring, though perhaps a bit too eager to please others. He worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm and made a decent living, but nothing extravagant. When he told me he was getting married, I was genuinely happy for him. I wanted nothing more than to see him settled and content. I even offered to help pay for the wedding, contributing $15,000 toward what Stephanie insisted had to be a perfect celebration. The wedding was beautiful, held at an upscale country club with over 200 guests. Stephanie looked stunning in her designer gown, and Marcus beamed with happiness throughout the ceremony. I remember thinking that day that maybe I'd been wrong about my initial impressions of her. Perhaps her intensity was just perfectionism, and her questions about finances were simply practical considerations for a young couple starting their life together. The first few months of their marriage seemed peaceful enough. They rented a small apartment across town, and I made sure to give them space to establish their relationship. I called maybe once a week, and always asked Marcus if it was a good time to talk. I didn't want to be one of those overbearing mothers-in-law who couldn't let go. When I did see them, usually for Sunday dinners that I'd cook at my house, Stephanie was polite but distant. She'd compliment my cooking with the kind of enthusiasm that felt rehearsed, and she'd help with the dishes while making comments about how much work it must be to maintain such a large house alone. It was during one of these Sunday dinners that I first noticed the way Stephanie looked at my home. While Marcus and I were reminiscing about his childhood, she wandered through the living room, running her fingers along the antique furniture and studying the family photographs on the mantel. When she thought no one was watching, I saw her open the drawers of my writing desk and peek inside. When I asked if she was looking for something, she smiled brightly and said she was just admiring the craftsmanship of the old furniture. The comment started subtly. During dinner, she'd mention how difficult it must be for someone my age to keep up with yard work and house maintenance. She'd suggest that I might be happier in a smaller place, somewhere more manageable, perhaps one of those nice senior communities that were popping up around town. When I brushed off these suggestions, explaining that I loved my home and had no intention of leaving, she'd exchange glances with Marcus that I pretended not to notice. As winter approached, these conversations became more frequent and less subtle. Stephanie began bringing up news articles about elderly people who'd been injured in falls at home, or stories about break-ins in suburban neighborhoods. She'd share statistics about the costs of maintaining older homes and wonder aloud how I managed to afford the upkeep on a fixed income. When I mentioned that Robert had left me well provided for and that I had savings and investments, her interest seemed to sharpen. The truth was, Robert had been incredibly responsible about our financial future. In addition to the paid-off house, he'd left me with a substantial life insurance policy, a healthy retirement account, and a portfolio of investments that continued to grow. I lived comfortably but modestly, more concerned with security than luxury. I'd never discussed the exact details of my finances with Marcus, feeling that it wasn't necessary and not wanting money to complicate our relationship. But somehow, Stephanie seemed to have an intuitive sense that there was more to my financial situation than met the eye. She began asking more direct questions about my plans for the future, whether I'd updated my will recently, and what I intended to do with the house eventually. When I deflected these questions or changed the subject, she'd persist with the kind of determination that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The breaking point came on a cold February morning when I woke up feeling dizzy and nauseous. I'd been battling what I thought was a stubborn flu for over a week, but that morning was particularly bad. I could barely keep water down, and when I tried to stand, the room spun violently around me. Panic set in as I realized I needed help, so I called Marcus from my bedroom phone. He arrived within 20 minutes, his face creased with worry as he helped me get dressed and drove me to the emergency room. The doctors ran a series of tests and determined that I was severely dehydrated and had developed a concerning irregularity in my heart rhythm. They wanted to keep me for observation and further testing, concerned that there might be an underlying cardiac issue that needed attention. I spent 3 days in the hospital, during which Marcus visited every evening after work. He brought me magazines and sat by my bedside, holding my hand and reassuring me that everything would be fine. It reminded me of when he was young and would comfort me during thunderstorms, his small hand patting my arm while he promised that the scary sounds would stop soon. Those hospital visits felt like precious time together, just the two of us, without the complicated dynamics that had developed since his marriage. On the 4th day, the doctors cleared me to go home with strict instructions to rest and follow up with my primary care physician. Marcus picked me up and helped me settle back into my house, making sure I had everything I needed before he left for work. I was grateful to be home, but still felt weak and shaky. The experience had been frightening, a stark reminder of my mortality and my increasing vulnerability as I aged. That evening, Marcus returned with groceries and insisted on making dinner for me. As he moved around my kitchen, preparing a simple meal of soup and sandwiches, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for his care and attention. We ate together at my dining room table, talking quietly about my recovery and his work, and for a moment it felt like old times, before marriage had divided his attention and loyalty. It was just after 8 o'clock when we heard Stephanie's car in the driveway. Marcus had texted her earlier to let her know where he was, but I was surprised when she came inside without knocking, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor of my entryway. She appeared in the dining room doorway, still wearing her work clothes and carrying her designer handbag, her expression unreadable. "How are you feeling, Corinne?" she asked, though her tone suggested the question was more obligatory than genuine. "Better, thank you," I replied, trying to inject warmth into my voice despite feeling suddenly tense. "The doctors say I should be back to normal in a few days." She nodded and moved into the room, placing her purse on my antique sideboard with a thud that made me wince. "Marcus told me about your heart episode. That must have been terrifying." The way she said heart episode made it sound trivial, like a minor inconvenience rather than the serious medical event it had been. I felt Marcus shift uncomfortably in his chair beside me. "It was concerning," I admitted, "but the doctors were wonderful, and I'm grateful it wasn't more serious." Stephanie moved closer to the table, and that's when I noticed her expression change. Her nose wrinkled slightly, and she took a small step backward, her hand moving unconsciously to cover her mouth and nose. "Oh my God," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "That smell." Marcus looked up sharply. "What smell?" Stephanie's eyes fixed on me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of disgust and something that looked almost like triumph. "It's coming from her. She smells like death." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat frozen in my chair, feeling heat flood my cheeks as humiliation washed over me. Marcus stared at his wife in shock, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Stephanie," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. But she wasn't finished. "I'm serious, Marcus. It's this sickly, medicinal smell. Like decay. It's probably from all those medications and being in the hospital. Old people get that smell when they're..." She trailed off, but the implication hung in the air between us. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. In that moment, sitting in my own home, where I'd raised my son and built a life with my late husband, I felt smaller and more alone than I ever had before. The casual cruelty of her words, delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence, cut deeper than any physical pain I'd experienced in the hospital. "I think you should apologize," Marcus said quietly, but there was uncertainty in his voice, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to make demands of his wife. Stephanie laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off my dining room walls. "Apologize for what? For pointing out the obvious? Marcus, you can't tell me you haven't noticed. It's gotten worse since she got sick. It's like being around someone who's already halfway gone." I pushed back from the table slowly, my hands shaking as I gripped the arms of my chair. Every instinct told me to flee, to escape to my bedroom where I could process this humiliation in private. But something else stirred within me, something I hadn't felt in years. It was anger, pure and clean and righteous. "I think," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "that you should leave my house." Stephanie's eyebrows shot up in apparent surprise. "Excuse me? You heard me." I stood up, drawing myself to my full height. "This is my home, and I won't be spoken to that way in it. I'd like you to leave." For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Marcus looked back and forth between us, his face pale and conflicted.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I could see the war playing out in his expression, loyalty to his mother battling against his desire to keep peace with his wife. "Corrine," Stephanie said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone, "I think you're overreacting. I was just concerned about your health. Maybe you should sit down before you fall down." The condescension in her voice was the final straw. I walked to my front door and opened it wide, the February air rushing in and making me shiver in my thin sweater. "Get out," I said simply. Stephanie gathered her purse and coat, her movements sharp and angry. As she passed me in the doorway, she paused and looked directly into my eyes. "You know I'm right," she said quietly, so only I could hear. "And deep down, Marcus knows it too. You're just a burden now, taking up space in a house too big for you, holding on to things that should belong to the living." Then she was gone, her car starting with an expensive purr and disappearing down my driveway. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding from the confrontation. When I turned around, Marcus was standing in the hallway, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking younger than his 33 years. "Mom," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'm tired, Marcus. I think I need to rest now." He nodded, understanding that the evening was over, but he lingered as if there was something more he wanted to say. Finally, he approached me and gave me a gentle hug. "I'm sorry," he whispered against my hair. She didn't mean it the way it sounded. But we both knew that wasn't true. As he gathered his things and left, I stood in my quiet house and felt the weight of what had happened settle over me. Stephanie's words had been calculated and cruel, designed to make me feel diminished and unwelcome in my own home. But more than that, they had revealed something about how she saw me, and, by extension, how she wanted Marcus to see me. I was no longer a person to her. I was an obstacle, a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed. And judging by Marcus's inability to defend me, she was succeeding in making him see me that way too. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of the encounter. The humiliation was still there, burning in my chest like heartburn, but underneath it, something else was growing. It was resolve, cold and hard and absolutely certain. Stephanie thought she could dismiss me, diminish me, and ultimately discard me. She thought my age made me weak, my recent illness made me vulnerable, and my love for my son made me controllable. She thought she could systematically undermine my relationship with Marcus until I became irrelevant in his life, clearing the way for whatever plan she had for my house, my assets, and my future. She was wrong on every count. Over the next few days, as I recovered from my hospital stay, I began to pay attention to things I'd previously overlooked. I noticed how Stephanie's questions about my finances had become more frequent and specific. I remembered her casual comments about senior living facilities and her suggestions that maintaining my house was becoming too much for me. I thought about the way she'd photographed my home during her early visits and how she'd been exploring my personal belongings when she thought I wasn't watching. A picture was emerging, and it wasn't flattering. Stephanie wasn't just a difficult daughter-in-law who didn't like me. She was a woman with a plan, and that plan involved separating me from my assets and my independence. Her cruelty the night she'd insulted me wasn't just meanness. It was strategy. She was working to make me feel so unwelcome and uncomfortable in my own life that I'd voluntarily remove myself from it. I began to research, spending hours on my computer learning about elder abuse, financial exploitation, and the legal protections available to people in my situation. What I discovered was both alarming and empowering. Stories of adult children and their spouses who systematically isolated elderly parents, undermined their confidence, and gradually took control of their assets were disturbingly common. But I also learned about the resources available to fight back, the legal remedies that existed, and the importance of documenting everything. I started keeping a journal, recording every interaction with Stephanie and Marcus, noting dates, times, and exact conversations. I made copies of all my financial documents and stored them in a safety deposit box that only I could access. I contacted my attorney and scheduled an appointment to review and update my will, making sure that my wishes were clearly documented and legally protected. But most importantly, I began to plan. If Stephanie wanted to play games with my family and my future, she was about to discover that I was far from the helpless old woman she imagined me to be. I had resources she didn't know about, connections she couldn't access, and a lifetime of experience she couldn't match. The morning after my revelation, I called my old friend Patricia, who worked as a private investigator. Patricia and I had known each other since college, and she'd built a successful business helping people uncover the truth about situations exactly like mine. "Corey," she said when I explained why I was calling, "I'm not surprised. I've seen this pattern before. The good news is that you're recognizing it early, and you're ready to do something about it. The bad news is that it's probably going to get worse before it gets better." We made an appointment for her to come to my house the following week, when I knew Marcus and Stephanie would be at work. Patricia would help me document everything, investigate Stephanie's background, and develop a strategy for protecting myself and my assets. In the meantime, I continued my own research. I learned that Stephanie's tech startup job might not be as secure as she'd led us to believe. The company had been struggling financially, and there had been several rounds of layoffs in recent months. I discovered that she and Marcus had significant credit card debt, much more than Marcus had ever mentioned to me. I found out that the expensive clothes and lifestyle Stephanie maintained were likely financed through debt rather than income. The picture that emerged was of a young woman who was living beyond her means and looking for a solution to her financial problems. My house, my assets, and my eventual inheritance represented that solution. Marcus, with his gentle nature and desire to please, was the perfect vehicle for accessing what she wanted. As I learned more, my anger transformed into something more powerful and sustainable. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was motivated. Stephanie had made a serious mistake when she'd underestimated me and shown her hand too early. Now I knew what I was dealing with, and I could plan accordingly. The next Sunday, Marcus called to ask if they could come for dinner as usual. I agreed, but this time I was prepared. I had installed a small recording device in my dining room, hidden among my collection of antique figurines. I'd documented my physical and mental state with my doctor, establishing a baseline of my competency and health. I'd spoken with my attorney about my concerns and my plans. When they arrived, I was the picture of gracious hospitality. I'd prepared Marcus's favorite meal and set the table with my best china and crystal. I greeted them both warmly, as if our previous encounter had never happened. Throughout dinner, I watched and listened carefully. Stephanie was more subdued than usual, perhaps thinking her harsh words had achieved their intended effect. She complimented my cooking and asked polite questions about my recovery, playing the role of the concerned daughter-in-law perfectly. But I noticed other things too. The way she surveyed my dining room, as if cataloging its contents. The questions she asked about my daily routine and whether I'd given any more thought to simplifying my living situation. The glances she exchanged with Marcus when she thought I wasn't looking. After dinner, as we sat in my living room with coffee, Stephanie began her usual campaign of suggestions disguised as concern. "Corinne," she said, her voice gentle and caring, "Marcus and I have been talking, and we're worried about you living alone in such a big house, especially after your recent health scare." I sipped my coffee calmly. "Oh? What kind of worries?" "Well, what if something happened to you, and no one was here to help? What if you fell down the stairs or had another episode? We just think you might be safer somewhere with people around, somewhere designed for people your age." Marcus shifted uncomfortably on the sofa beside her, but he didn't contradict her concerns. "I appreciate your worry," I said carefully, "but I'm quite comfortable here. This is my home." Stephanie leaned forward, her expression earnest. "But think about the practical aspects. The maintenance, the yard work, the expenses. Wouldn't it be easier to let someone else handle all of that? You could use the money from selling this place to buy something smaller and have plenty left over to enjoy your retirement." There it was, the suggestion that I sell my house. Not for my benefit, but so that Marcus could inherit the proceeds while I was still alive to watch it happen. "The money isn't a concern," I said evenly. "Robert left me well provided for." I saw something flicker in Stephanie's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. She hadn't expected me to admit to having financial resources beyond what the house might bring. "Of course," she said quickly. "But still, wouldn't it be nice to have less responsibility? More freedom?" I smiled at her, a grandmother's indulgent smile that masked the steel beneath. Freedom is an interesting concept. I've found that true freedom comes from having options, not from having them taken away. The conversation continued for another hour, with Stephanie becoming increasingly persistent and Marcus growing more uncomfortable. By the time they left, I had recorded enough material to clearly document her campaign to convince me to sell my house and move into some form of managed care. That night, I transcribed the entire conversation into my journal, noting the specific phrases she'd used and the increasing pressure she'd applied as the evening progressed. I was building a case piece by piece, documenting a pattern of manipulation and financial pressure that would be crucial if I ever needed legal protection. The next morning, I called my attorney again and scheduled an emergency appointment. It was time to take more decisive action to protect myself and my assets from whatever Stephanie had planned. The meeting with my attorney, Gerald Whitman, took place on a crisp Thursday morning in his downtown office. Gerald had handled Robert's estate after his death and had been our family lawyer for over 20 years. He was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But I knew from experience that his gentle demeanor masked a sharp legal mind and fierce protective instincts when it came to his clients. I had prepared carefully for this meeting, bringing copies of my financial documents, my journal entries documenting Stephanie's behavior, and a written summary of my concerns. Gerald listened intently as I explained the situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes on his legal pad. "Corey," he said when I finished my account, "what you're describing is unfortunately not uncommon. It's a form of elder abuse that often goes unrecognized because it starts gradually and is perpetrated by family members who are supposed to have your best interests at heart." He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers as he considered my situation. "The good news is that you're recognizing the pattern early and you're taking proactive steps to protect yourself. Many people don't realize what's happening until significant damage has already been done." I felt a mixture of validation and apprehension. What kind of damage are we talking about? Financial exploitation can take many forms, Gerald explained. Sometimes it's outright theft or forgery. More often, it's psychological pressure designed to make the elderly person feel incompetent or burdensome until they voluntarily give up control of their assets. Based on what you've told me, it sounds like Stephanie is pursuing the latter strategy. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began outlining a protection plan. First, we need to update your estate planning documents to ensure they reflect your current wishes and include specific protections against undue influence. Second, we should consider establishing a revocable living trust that gives you complete control during your lifetime but makes it much more difficult for anyone to challenge your decisions or coerce you into changes. The conversation continued for over an hour as Gerald explained various legal strategies and protections available to me. By the time I left his office, I had a clear action plan and several appointments scheduled for the following weeks. More importantly, I had confirmation that my instincts about Stephanie were correct, and that legal remedies existed to protect myself. That afternoon, I had lunch with Patricia, my private investigator friend. We met at a quiet restaurant across town, where we were unlikely to be seen by anyone who knew Marcus or Stephanie. Patricia had already begun her preliminary research, and what she'd discovered was illuminating. Your instincts about their financial situation were right on target, Patricia said, pulling out a folder of documents. Stephanie has 3 credit cards that are maxed out, totaling about $45,000 in debt. Marcus has been helping her make minimum payments, but it's clearly straining their budget. She showed me printouts of public records and credit reports that painted a picture of a young couple living well beyond their means. The interesting thing is that most of this debt was accumulated after their marriage. Stephanie appears to have dramatically increased her spending once she had access to Marcus's income. I studied the documents, feeling my understanding of the situation deepen. So she's not just interested in my assets for the future, she needs money now. Exactly, Patricia confirmed. And there's more. The tech startup where she works? They've been laying people off for months. And according to my sources in the industry, they're likely to close completely within the next 6 months. Stephanie may already know her job is in jeopardy. This revelation cast Stephanie's recent behavior in an entirely new light. Her increasing pressure for me to downsize wasn't just about eventually inheriting my house. It was about immediate financial relief from a desperate situation. I also looked into her background before she met Marcus, Patricia continued. She has a pattern of short-term relationships with older, financially stable men. Marcus isn't the first man she's targeted for his family's assets. I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you saying she specifically pursued Marcus because of what she thought he might inherit? Patricia nodded grimly. The timeline suggests it's possible. She met him at a professional networking event, where the topic of real estate investments came up. Several people remember her asking detailed questions about property values in your neighborhood. As I absorbed this information, I felt my protective instincts toward Marcus sharpen. He wasn't just caught in the middle of a difficult family situation. He was the victim of a calculated scheme, manipulated by someone who had never truly cared about him as a person. The following week, I met with a financial advisor recommended by Gerald to review and restructure my assets for maximum protection. Elizabeth Chen was a certified financial planner who specialized in elder financial security. She reviewed my portfolio with impressive thoroughness and made several recommendations that would make it much more difficult for anyone to gain inappropriate access to my resources. The key, Elizabeth explained, is maintaining your complete autonomy while creating multiple layers of protection against coercion or fraud. We want to structure things so that even if someone were to forge your signature or pressure you into signing documents, there would be built-in safeguards that would trigger review processes. She recommended establishing several different types of accounts with different access requirements, creating a system where any major financial decision would require multiple steps and verifications. It might seem overly complicated, she admitted, but complexity is your friend in situations like this. By the end of March, I had implemented most of the protective measures recommended by my legal and financial advisors. My assets were restructured and protected. My estate planning documents were updated with ironclad language protecting against undue influence, and I had established relationships with professionals who understood my situation and were prepared to support me if things escalated. But Stephanie's campaign was escalating too. She had begun calling me directly, something she had rarely done before, with increasingly frequent expressions of concern about my well-being. These calls always followed the same pattern: initial inquiries about my health, followed by observations about the challenges of maintaining my house, and ending with suggestions about alternative living arrangements. During one particularly memorable call, she expressed worry about my social isolation and suggested that I might be depressed living alone in such a big house. When I mentioned that I had plenty of friends and social activities, she immediately began questioning the reliability of elderly friendships and the safety of driving at night to social events. "Corey," she said in a tone that managed to be both caring and condescending, "I think you might not realize how much your recent health issues have affected your judgment. Sometimes older people don't recognize when they're not thinking as clearly as they used to." It was a masterful piece of manipulation, designed to make me question my own mental competency while positioning herself as the voice of reason and concern. If I had been less prepared, less aware of her tactics, it might have worked. Instead, I thanked her for her concern and mentioned that I had recently had a complete physical and cognitive evaluation with my doctor, who had pronounced me in excellent mental health for someone my age. I could hear the frustration in her voice as she realized her subtle undermining wasn't having the desired effect. The turning point came in early April during what I would later think of as the Easter dinner ambush. Marcus had called to ask if they could join me for Easter Sunday dinner, a tradition we had maintained for years. I agreed, though by this point I was wary of any family gathering that might provide Stephanie with an opportunity to advance her agenda. I spent Saturday preparing an elaborate meal, partly because I genuinely enjoyed cooking for my family, and partly because I wanted to demonstrate my continued capability and independence. I prepared a glazed ham, scalloped potatoes, fresh asparagus, homemade rolls, and a lemon meringue pie that had been Marcus's favorite since childhood. They arrived Sunday afternoon bearing a bouquet of grocery store flowers and a bottle of wine. Stephanie was dressed in what appeared to be a new outfit, another expensive ensemble that seemed inconsistent with someone facing financial difficulties. She complimented my table setting and the smell of the cooking food, playing the role of the appreciative daughter-in-law perfectly. During dinner, the conversation was pleasant and general. We discussed Marcus's work, the changing weather, and neighborhood news. Stephanie seemed more relaxed than she had been in recent months, and I began to wonder if perhaps I had been reading too much into her previous behavior. That hope was shattered during dessert. "Corey," Stephanie began, setting down her fork and adopting a serious expression, "Marcus and I have been doing a lot of research, and we think we found the perfect solution for your living situation." I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "Oh? What kind of solution?" Marcus looked uncomfortable, glancing between his wife and me as if he wasn't entirely sure how this conversation was going to unfold. "There's a beautiful senior living community about 20 minutes from here," Stephanie continued enthusiastically. "It's called Sunset Manor, and it's specifically designed for active seniors who want to maintain their independence while having access to support services." She pulled out a glossy brochure from her purse and spread it on my dining table. "Look at these amenities. They have a fitness center, a library, organized social activities, and restaurant-style dining. You wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning or yard work anymore." I glanced at the brochure, noting the luxurious accommodations and the emphasis on worry-free living. "It looks very nice," I said neutrally, "but I'm quite happy in my own home." "But think about the practicalities," Stephanie pressed. "What if you have another health episode? What if you fall and no one finds you for hours? At Sunset Manor, there would always be someone available to help." Marcus finally spoke up. "Mom, we're just worried about you. After what happened in February, we realized how vulnerable you are living alone." The phrase, "vulnerable you are," hung in the air between us. I realized this wasn't a spontaneous suggestion born of concern. This was a planned intervention designed to present moving to assisted living as the only reasonable option for someone in my situation. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I've already taken steps to address those issues. I've had a medical alert system installed, and I have regular check-ins with several friends and neighbors." Stephanie's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Those are good temporary measures, but they're not really a long-term solution. And honestly, Corey, maintaining this house is becoming a real burden. The utilities, the maintenance, the property taxes, it's probably costing you a fortune. There was something in her tone that made me realize we had moved beyond suggestions into something more aggressive. This wasn't a conversation anymore, it was a sales pitch. The financial aspects of my life are quite manageable, I replied calmly. Are they, though? Stephanie leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge of urgency. Have you really calculated all the costs? What happens if you need major home repairs? What if your health deteriorates and you need in-home care? Do you have any idea how expensive that can be? Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable as his wife's pressure tactics became more obvious, but he didn't intervene. I realized that whatever private discussions they'd had about this topic, he had been convinced that this approach was necessary for my own good. Stephanie, I said, my voice remaining level despite the anger building inside me, I understand you're concerned, but these are decisions I'm capable of making for myself. Are you, though? She asked, and suddenly her mask slipped completely. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're being stubborn and unrealistic about your limitations. You had a heart episode 3 months ago. You're living alone in a house that's way too big for you, and you're getting older every day. At what point do you stop pretending you can handle everything yourself? The cruelty in her voice was shocking, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't about my well-being or my safety. This was about control, and about removing obstacles to whatever financial plans she had for my assets. Marcus was staring at his wife with an expression of surprise and dismay, as if he was seeing this side of her for the first time. Stephanie, he said quietly, that's not how we talked about approaching this. But Stephanie was beyond subtle manipulation now. She had committed to this strategy and was going to see it through. Marcus, someone has to be realistic here. Your mother is being selfish and short-sighted. She's holding on to a house and a lifestyle she can't maintain. And when something bad happens, and it will happen, we're going to be the ones who have to deal with the consequences. The word selfish hung in the air like a slap. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest as I realized the full extent of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just financial opportunism. This was a systematic campaign to break down my confidence and autonomy until I capitulated to her demands. I stood up slowly, gathering the dessert plates with steady hands. I think this conversation is over, I said quietly. No, it's not over, Stephanie snapped, her composure completely gone now. It's not over until you stop being stubborn and start thinking about what's best for everyone. Do you have any idea how much stress you're putting on Marcus? Do you know how worried he is about you? But you're so selfish you can't see past your own attachment to this house. Marcus finally found his voice. Stephanie, stop. This isn't what we discussed. But she was beyond stopping. What we discussed was that someone needed to make your mother face reality. She's an old woman living in a house she can't take care of, burning through money she should be preserving, and refusing to accept help because she's too proud to admit she needs it. I set the plates down on my sideboard and turned to face her directly. Get out of my house. See? Stephanie appealed to Marcus desperately. This is exactly what I'm talking about. She can't handle any kind of reasonable discussion about her future. She just gets defensive and shuts down. This is what happens when elderly people start losing their capacity for rational thought. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. She was attempting to use my perfectly reasonable response to her attacks as evidence of my mental incapacity. I said, get out, I repeated, my voice stronger now. Marcus stood up, his face pale and conflicted. Mom, I think we all need to calm down and... No, Marcus, I interrupted, looking directly at him. There's nothing to calm down about. Your wife has made her position very clear. She thinks I'm selfish, stubborn, mentally incompetent, and a burden on your life. She wants me to sell my house and move into institutional care so that she can stop worrying about the stress I'm apparently causing you. I turned to Stephanie, who was standing rigid with anger. And you've made it clear that you see my independence and my attachment to my home as obstacles to be overcome rather than preferences to be respected. So yes, I want you to leave my house." Stephanie grabbed her purse and stood up abruptly. "Fine, but don't come crying to us when you fall down these stairs, or have another heart attack and nobody finds you for days. And don't expect Marcus to keep dropping everything to take care of you when you're too stubborn to take care of yourself." She stormed toward the front door, then turned back for one final shot. "You know what your problem is, Karine? You think being old gives you the right to be difficult. But it doesn't. It just makes you a burden on people who actually have lives to live." The front door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. Marcus stood in my dining room looking devastated, his hands hanging at his sides. "Mom," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Not tonight, Marcus. I need time to think about what just happened here." He nodded miserably and gathered his jacket. As he reached the door, he turned back. "She's not usually like this. She's been under a lot of stress lately, with work and everything. I think she just got carried away." I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved and supported through every challenge of his life, and saw a stranger. "Marcus," I said gently, "your wife just called me selfish, stubborn, mentally incompetent, and a burden. She suggested I was too old to make my own decisions, and too difficult to deserve care and respect. That's not getting carried away. That's showing you who she really is." After he left, I sat in my quiet house and processed what had just occurred. The facade had finally dropped completely. Stephanie had revealed the depth of her contempt for me, and the extent of her plans for my life. She wanted me out of my house, preferably in some form of managed care, where my assets could be more easily accessed and my autonomy more thoroughly controlled. But she had also made a crucial mistake. By pushing too hard and showing her true nature too clearly, she had given me everything I needed to protect myself and potentially save my son from a marriage built on manipulation and financial opportunism. I spent the rest of that evening documenting every detail of the conversation in my journal, noting specific phrases and the escalation of Stephanie's tactics. Then I called Patricia and left a message asking her to expedite her investigation into Stephanie's background and current financial situation. The next morning, I contacted Gerald and scheduled an emergency meeting. It was time to move from defensive measures to more proactive strategies. Stephanie had declared war on my independence and autonomy. She was about to discover that she had chosen the wrong opponent. Over the next few days, I didn't hear from Marcus, which was unusual but not entirely surprising given the way our Easter dinner had ended. I used the time to research Sunset Manor, the senior living facility Stephanie had been promoting so enthusiastically. What I discovered was instructive. Sunset Manor was indeed a high-end facility, with excellent amenities and care. It was also extraordinarily expensive, with entrance fees starting at $200,000 and monthly costs that could easily exceed $5,000. For someone with substantial assets, it might represent a comfortable lifestyle choice. For someone looking to quickly liquidate an elderly relative's estate, it represented an efficient way to convert home equity into ongoing expenses. I also researched the legal and financial processes involved in moving into such a facility. Most required comprehensive financial disclosure and often suggested or required giving power of attorney to family members to handle the complex arrangements. It was a perfect setup for someone seeking control over an elderly person's assets. The more I learned, the more I appreciated the sophistication of Stephanie's plan. She wasn't pursuing a crude scheme to steal my money. She was engineering a situation where I would voluntarily surrender control of my finances and living situation, convinced that it was the responsible and caring thing to do. On Thursday of that week, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, enjoying the mild spring weather and tending to my flower beds, when I heard a car in my driveway. I looked up to see Marcus getting out of his sedan, alone. He approached me hesitantly, as if unsure of his welcome. "Hi, Mom. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" I gestured to the patio chairs on my back deck. "Of course. Would you like some iced tea?" "That would be nice," he said, settling into one of the chairs while I went inside to prepare drinks. When I returned, he was staring out at the yard with an expression I couldn't quite read. I handed him his glass and sat down across from him, waiting for him to begin. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "What happened on Sunday was completely out of line. Stephanie's approach was wrong, and I should have stopped her." I sipped my tea and studied my son's face. "What's changed since Sunday?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about what you said. About Stephanie showing me who she really is. And I've been paying attention to things I might have been ignoring before." "What kinds of things?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Her attitude toward you, for one thing. I always told myself she was just concerned, maybe a little overprotective. But listening to her on Sunday, hearing the way she talked to you." He trailed off, shaking his head. "And?" I prompted gently. "And I started looking at our finances more carefully. Did you know she's been using our joint credit card to research senior living facilities? Not just Sunset Manor, but places all over the region. She's been requesting information packets and pricing structures for months." I felt a chill of recognition. "Did you ask her about it?" "I tried to. She said she was doing research to help you make informed decisions when you were ready. But Mom, some of these places are really expensive. Like, sell your house to afford the entrance fee expensive." Marcus set down his glass and leaned forward. "I think I've been really naive about her motivations. When she talks about being worried about you, I don't think she's worried about your safety or happiness. I think she's worried about..." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "About my interfering with her financial plans?" I suggested. He nodded miserably. "I never thought about it that way before. I just saw someone who was concerned about my mother's welfare. But if I'm honest, her concern always seems to involve you giving up your independence and liquidating your assets." It was painful to watch my son come to terms with the reality of his marriage, but it was also hopeful. If Marcus could see Stephanie's true nature clearly, there might be a chance to protect him as well as myself. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to confront her directly, but I'm afraid that will just make things worse. And part of me wonders what else I don't know about the person I married." I reached across the table and took his hand. "Marcus, I want you to know that whatever happens between you and Stephanie, it won't affect my relationship with you. You're my son, and I love you. But I also need you to understand that I'm not going to let anyone, including family members, manipulate or coerce me into giving up my independence." He squeezed my hand. "I understand. And I support you. I should have supported you from the beginning." "You're supporting me now," I said. "That's what matters." We talked for another hour, discussing the situation from various angles and beginning to develop strategies for dealing with Stephanie's continued pressure. Marcus agreed to be more observant of her behavior and to resist being used as a conduit for her manipulations. As he prepared to leave, he paused at my back door. "Mom, are you really okay living here alone? I mean, honestly okay, not just being stubborn about it?" I smiled at him. "Honestly, Marcus, I'm more than okay. This is my home, I'm in good health, I'm financially secure, and I have good friends and support systems. The only thing that's been making me unhappy lately is feeling like I have to defend my choices to people who should be supporting them." He nodded, understanding. "I won't let that happen anymore." After Marcus left, I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't experienced in months. My son was beginning to see the situation clearly, and that meant I wasn't fighting this battle entirely alone. But I also knew that Stephanie wouldn't give up easily. If anything, Marcus's withdrawal of support would make her more desperate and potentially more dangerous. That weekend, I had lunch with my friend Margaret, who had been following my situation with growing concern. Margaret was 5 years older than me and had dealt with her own challenges related to adult children who had become overly involved in her financial decisions. "The thing you have to remember," Margaret said as we shared a quiet meal at her kitchen table, "is that this isn't really about money. It's about power and control. People like Stephanie need to feel like they're in charge of their environment, and your independence threatens that need. So what do I do about it?" Margaret smiled, and I saw something steely in her expression. "You remind her that you're not as powerless as she thinks you are. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense." As I drove home from Margaret's house, her words echoed in my mind. I had been focused on protecting myself from Stephanie's schemes, but perhaps it was time to consider more proactive measures. I had gathered extensive information about her financial situation, her employment prospects, and her pattern of manipulative behavior. The question was whether and how to use that information. That evening, I received a phone call that would change everything. It was Patricia, and her voice was tight with excitement. "Corey, I found something. Something big. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I think it's time to take the gloves off." I met Patricia at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town the next morning, my curiosity and anticipation making it difficult to sleep the night before. She was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, a manila folder spread open in front of her, and a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "Corey," she said as I sat down across from her, "you're not going to believe what I've uncovered. Your daughter-in-law isn't just financially desperate. She's been running a long-term con, and Marcus isn't her first victim." Patricia slid a photograph across the table. It showed Stephanie at what appeared to be an upscale social event, her arm linked with a distinguished-looking man who was clearly much older than Marcus. "This was taken 18 months before she met your son," Patricia explained. "The man's name is David Hartwell. He's 72 years old, a widower, and he owns a chain of successful auto dealerships across 3 states. I studied the photograph, noting how comfortable and intimate Stephanie appeared with this stranger. "What happened to him?" "That's where it gets interesting," Patricia continued, pulling out more documents. "Stephanie dated David for about 8 months. During that time, she convinced him to add her to several of his bank accounts and to change his will to include her as a beneficiary. She moved into his house and began managing his social calendar and daily affairs. The parallels to my own situation were chilling. How did it end? David's adult daughter became suspicious when Stephanie started pressuring her father to sell his house and move into a senior living facility. Sound familiar?" Patricia's expression was grim. The daughter hired an attorney and discovered that nearly $50,000 had been transferred from her father's accounts to credit cards that Stephanie had opened in his name. I felt my stomach drop. What happened then? David confronted Stephanie, and she disappeared overnight, just packed up and left town without a word. The daughter tried to pursue criminal charges, but Stephanie had been careful to stay just within the bounds of legal manipulation. David had voluntarily given her access to his accounts, and she hadn't technically forged anything. Patricia showed me more photographs and documents. But here's the thing, Corey. This wasn't an isolated incident. I found evidence of at least 3 similar relationships over the past 5 years. Same pattern every time. Target an older man with assets, gain his trust, move toward financial control, then disappear when family members or legal pressure gets too intense. The scope of Stephanie's deception was staggering. How did she end up with Marcus? From what I can piece together, she was getting more sophisticated. Marcus represents a different strategy. Instead of targeting the elderly person directly, she married the heir and is working to accelerate the inheritance process. It's actually more elegant from a legal standpoint because she has legitimate family standing to express concern about your welfare. I absorbed this information, feeling a mixture of vindication and horror. My instincts about Stephanie had been correct, but the reality was worse than I had imagined. There's more, Patricia continued. I've been monitoring her recent activities, and she's been in contact with several estate planning attorneys. Not to establish plans for her and Marcus, but to research the legal requirements for having someone declared incompetent to manage their own affairs. The blood seemed to drain from my face. She's planning to have me declared mentally incompetent? It appears so. In this state, if family members can demonstrate that an elderly person is making irrational decisions that put them at risk, they can petition the court for guardianship. Once that happens, the guardian has complete control over the person's finances and living arrangements. The elegance of Stephanie's ultimate strategy was breathtaking and terrifying. She didn't need to convince me to sell my house or move to assisted living. She just needed to create enough evidence of my supposed incompetence that a court would remove my right to make those decisions myself. The good news, Patricia said, is that now we know what we're dealing with. We can fight back strategically. And we have ammunition she doesn't know we have. I leaned forward, feeling a surge of determination. What kind of ammunition? Patricia smiled. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine hope in her expression. Financial fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse across multiple states. The statute of limitations hasn't expired on some of her previous activities, and with the right pressure, we might be able to get David Hartwell and some of her other victims to press charges. She pulled out another set of documents. But more immediately, we can use this information to protect you and potentially save Marcus from making the biggest mistake of his life. We spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive strategy. Patricia would continue documenting Stephanie's current activities while building a case file on her previous victims. I would work with Gerald to create additional legal protections and establish a clear record of my mental competence and decision-making capacity. Most importantly, we would begin applying pressure designed to make Stephanie understand that she had chosen the wrong target and that continuing her campaign against me would have serious consequences. The key, Patricia explained, is to make her believe that staying in this marriage and pursuing this plan is more dangerous than cutting her losses and moving on to an easier target. That afternoon, I had a long conversation with Gerald about our discoveries and our strategy. He listened intently, occasionally asking questions or making notes, his expression growing more serious as I related Patricia's findings. "This is a criminal enterprise," he said when I finished. "What you're describing isn't just elder abuse. It's organized fraud spanning multiple states and involving multiple victims." He leaned back in his chair, thinking. "The immediate question is whether we contact law enforcement now or wait until we have more evidence. There are advantages to both approaches. What do you recommend?" "I think we proceed carefully but aggressively. We document everything, build an airtight case, and give Stephanie one opportunity to walk away quietly before we bring in the authorities." Gerald outlined a legal strategy that would simultaneously protect me and create maximum pressure on Stephanie. "We're going to make it very clear that continuing her current course of action will result in criminal prosecution, civil liability, and public exposure of her previous activities. And if she doesn't back down, then we destroy her completely," Gerald said with quiet intensity. "We file criminal complaints in multiple states, pursue civil recovery for her previous victims, and make sure she never has the opportunity to victimize anyone else." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I met with a forensic accountant who specialized in financial elder abuse cases. I underwent comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations to establish my competence and capacity. I worked with Patricia to document every interaction I'd had with Stephanie, creating a timeline that clearly showed her manipulative escalation. Most importantly, I began implementing a plan designed to demonstrate to Stephanie that she had seriously underestimated her target. The first step was a carefully orchestrated encounter at the grocery store, where I knew Stephanie shopped. Patricia had been tracking her routine, and we knew she typically did her shopping on Thursday evenings after work. I positioned myself in the produce section at the right time, browsing vegetables with apparent casualness. When Stephanie appeared, pushing her cart and checking her phone, I made sure to be visible but didn't acknowledge her directly. She noticed me almost immediately and approached with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Corey, what a nice surprise. How are you feeling?" Her performance was flawless, the concerned daughter-in-law encountering her mother-in-law during routine errands. If I hadn't known what I now knew about her background and motivations, I might have been fooled by her apparent sincerity. "I'm doing very well, thank you," I replied warmly. "Actually, I'm feeling better than I have in years. I've been working with some wonderful new advisors who've helped me organize my affairs much more efficiently." I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, curiosity or perhaps concern. "Oh, what kind of advisors? Financial planners, estate attorneys, that sort of thing." After my health scare, I realized I needed to be more proactive about protecting my assets and ensuring my wishes are properly documented. Stephanie's smile remained fixed, but I could see her processing this information. "That sounds very responsible. I'm sure Marcus would be relieved to know you're taking those kinds of precautions." "Oh, I haven't mentioned it to Marcus yet," I said casually. "I wanted to have everything in place first. But I've been working with some real specialists. People who understand elder financial security and protection against fraud and manipulation." The word manipulation hung in the air between us. Stephanie's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. That's wonderful, she said, her voice maintaining its friendly tone. It's so important to work with people you can trust. Absolutely, I agreed. Trust is everything, isn't it? Especially when you discover that people aren't always who they appear to be. We parted ways after a few more minutes of pleasant conversation, but I could see that I had planted the intended seeds of uncertainty. Stephanie now knew that I was taking proactive steps to protect myself, and the reference to fraud and manipulation would give her something to think about. The next phase of our strategy involved Marcus. I called him that weekend and asked if he could stop by to help me with some paperwork. When he arrived, I had several official-looking documents spread across my dining room table. "What's all this?" he asked, settling into a chair beside me. "I've been working with some advisors to update my estate planning and financial management," I explained. "I wanted you to understand what I've put in place, both for your peace of mind and so you know what to expect in the future." I showed him the trust documents Gerald had prepared, the power of attorney forms that specifically protected against coercion, and the updated will that included detailed provisions against undue influence. "Mom, this all looks very comprehensive," Marcus said, reviewing the documents. "But some of this language is pretty specific. This section about protection against manipulation and fraud, is there something specific you're concerned about?" I had been waiting for this opening. "Marcus, I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll hear me out completely before you respond." Over the next hour, I shared everything Patricia had discovered about Stephanie's background. I showed him the photographs, the financial records, and the documentation of her previous relationships. I watched his face change from confusion to disbelief to horrified understanding. "This can't be right," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "There has to be some explanation." "I thought so too, initially," I said gently. "But the evidence is overwhelming, Marcus. And it explains everything about her behavior toward me, her pressure for me to sell the house, her research into senior living facilities." Marcus sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the documents spread before him. "She's been planning this from the beginning," he said finally. "Our entire relationship has been a lie." "I'm afraid so," I confirmed. "But Marcus, the important thing now is protecting yourself and making sure she doesn't succeed in whatever she has planned." "What do you mean, protecting myself?" I explained about the debt Stephanie had accumulated in both their names, the precarious situation with her employment, and the legal vulnerability he faced as her spouse if she were to be charged with fraud or elder abuse. "The good news," I told him, "is that we can fix this. But you need to be very careful about how you handle things with Stephanie from this point forward." We developed a plan for Marcus to protect himself financially while giving us time to implement our broader strategy. He would quietly secure his personal assets, monitor Stephanie's activities, and avoid any actions that might alert her to what we had discovered. "I feel like such an idiot," Marcus said as he prepared to leave. "How could I have been so blind?" "You weren't blind," I assured him. "You were manipulated by someone who is very skilled at this kind of deception. The important thing is that you see clearly now." After Marcus left, I called Patricia to update her on both encounters. "Perfect," she said. "Stephanie knows something has changed, but she doesn't know exactly what. That uncertainty will make her more likely to make mistakes." "What's our next move?" "We escalate," Patricia said. "It's time to let her know that we know exactly who she is and what she's been doing." The confrontation came sooner than expected. 3 days after my conversation with Marcus, Stephanie called me directly. Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Corey, I think we need to talk. There seems to be some confusion about my intentions regarding your welfare, and I'd like to clear the air." "Of course," I said pleasantly. "Would you like to come over for coffee? I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Stephanie arrived, she was dressed for battle in a sharp business suit, her hair pulled back severely, her expression coldly professional. She declined my offer of refreshments and got straight to the point. "I understand you've been spreading some very serious accusations about me," she began, settling into my living room chair with predatory alertness. "I haven't been spreading anything," I replied calmly. "I've been protecting myself and my family by learning the truth about the people in our lives." "What truth would that be?" I pulled out a folder from the side table next to my chair and set it on the coffee table between us. "The truth about David Hartwell, for starters, and Robert Chen, and Michael Sullivan. The color drained from Stephanie's face as she recognized the names of her previous victims. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," she said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "But I think you're confused about some things." "Am I confused about the $50,000 you transferred from David's accounts? Or the credit cards you opened in Robert's name? Or the way you disappeared when Michael's son started asking questions about his father's sudden interest in selling his house?" Stephanie stood up abruptly, her composure cracking. "You don't know what you're talking about. Those relationships ended for personal reasons that are none of your business." "Sit down, Stephanie," I said, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't used in years. "We're not finished talking." Something in my tone must have surprised her, because she hesitated, then slowly sat back down. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, opening the folder and spreading several documents across the table. "You're going to stop your campaign to have me declared incompetent. You're going to stop pressuring me to sell my house or move to assisted living. And you're going to end your marriage to my son before you destroy his life the way you've destroyed others." "You can't prove anything," Stephanie said, but her voice was shaking now. "Actually, I can prove quite a lot," I replied, showing her copies of financial records, photographs, and legal documents. "I can prove fraud across multiple states. I can prove identity theft. I can prove elder abuse. And I can prove that you've been systematically planning to victimize me the same way you victimized your previous targets." I leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. "What I can't prove yet is criminal intent in your current activities. But I'm very close, and once I have that evidence, I'm going to destroy you completely." Stephanie's mask finally slipped entirely. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she snarled. "I've been planning this for 2 years. I know everything about your finances, your health, your weaknesses. I know exactly how to make a case that you're incompetent to manage your own affairs. Do you?" I asked calmly. "Because I've spent the last month working with forensic accountants, elder law specialists, and private investigators. I've undergone comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations. I've documented every interaction we've had, including this conversation, which is being recorded." Her eyes widened as she realized the full scope of what she was facing. "You have a choice, Stephanie," I continued. "You can walk away from this marriage, leave town, and never contact my family again. If you do that, I might be persuaded not to pursue criminal charges for your previous activities. And if I don't, then I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure that you spend the next several years in prison. I will contact the victims of your previous schemes and help them pursue both criminal and civil cases against you. I will make sure that your activities are public knowledge, that your name and photograph are associated with elder fraud and financial abuse." I gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. "You came here thinking you could intimidate me into backing down. Instead, you've just confirmed everything I suspected about your plans and your methods." Stephanie stood up again, her hands trembling with rage. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," I said firmly. "The only question now is whether it ends quietly or whether it ends with your arrest." After she left, I sat in my quiet house, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The confrontation had been more intense than I had expected, but it had also been more successful. Stephanie now understood that she was facing a much more formidable opponent than she had anticipated. But I also knew that cornered animals were often the most dangerous. Stephanie's parting words suggested she wasn't ready to surrender, which meant the real battle was just beginning. I called Patricia immediately to report on the encounter. "She's rattled," I told her, "but she's not backing down yet." "That's actually good news," Patricia replied. "Desperate people make mistakes, and mistakes give us evidence." "What happens now?" "Now we watch and wait. She's going to try something, probably soon, and when she does, we'll be ready for her." The next few days were tense but quiet. Marcus called twice to check on me, and I could hear the strain in his voice. He was living with someone he now knew was a skilled manipulator and potential criminal, trying to act normal while protecting himself and gathering information for our case. The break came on Friday afternoon when Patricia called with excitement in her voice. "Corey, she's made her move, and it's exactly what we hoped she would do." "What kind of move?" She's filed a petition with the county court requesting guardianship over you on the grounds of mental incompetence. She's claiming that you've been making irrational financial decisions, that you're paranoid and delusional, and that you're a danger to yourself. I felt a chill of fear despite knowing this was likely to happen. Can she do that? She can try, Patricia said grimly, but she's just made the biggest mistake of her life. Filing false legal documents is a felony, and we have everything we need to prove that her claims are fraudulent. Gerald confirmed this when I met with him later that day. This is actually perfect, he said, reviewing the court documents. She's committed to a legal strategy that we can demolish completely, and in doing so, she's opened herself up to serious criminal liability. What do we do now? Now we go to war, Gerald said with satisfaction. And we're going to win. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, which gave us precious time to prepare our counterattack. Gerald immediately filed a response to Stephanie's petition, not only denying her claims, but also requesting sanctions against her for filing frivolous and malicious legal documents. More importantly, he filed a motion to have her petition dismissed with prejudice and to have her held in contempt of court. During those 3 weeks, Patricia worked around the clock to solidify our evidence. She contacted David Hartwell and the other victims of Stephanie's previous schemes, and to our satisfaction, they were eager to cooperate. David, in particular, was ready to press criminal charges once he understood that Stephanie was attempting the same manipulation on another family. I've been carrying guilt about this for 2 years, David told me during a phone call Patricia had arranged. I kept thinking I should have been smarter, should have seen through her act. When my daughter tried to warn me, I defended Stephanie because I thought I was in love with her. His voice was heavy with regret and anger. She didn't just steal my money, Mrs. Mitchell. She stole my dignity, my relationship with my daughter, and my trust in people. If testifying against her can prevent her from doing this to someone else, I'll do whatever it takes. The other victims had similar stories. Robert Chen, a retired professor, had lost $38,000 and had been estranged from his son for months because Stephanie had convinced him his family was only interested in his money. Michael Sullivan, a widowed businessman, had come within days of signing over power of attorney to her before his attorney became suspicious and launched an investigation that sent Stephanie fleeing. Gerald worked with prosecutors in 3 different states to build criminal cases against Stephanie for her previous activities. The evidence was overwhelming, and the pattern of behavior was unmistakable. More importantly, her current attempt to have me declared incompetent could now be viewed as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise, rather than an isolated incident. Meanwhile, I focused on documenting my own competence and capability. I underwent additional medical evaluations, including comprehensive cognitive testing that confirmed I was functioning at levels well above average for someone my age. I met with financial advisors who reviewed my investment decisions and money management, concluding that my financial choices were not only rational but demonstrated sophisticated understanding of estate planning and asset protection. Most importantly, Gerald arranged for me to be evaluated by Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist who specialized in elder abuse cases. Dr. Chen spent hours interviewing me, reviewing my medical records, and assessing my mental state and decision-making capacity. Mrs. Mitchell, she told me after completing her evaluation, not only are you completely competent to manage your own affairs, but your recognition of the manipulation being directed against you and your proactive response to protect yourself demonstrate exceptional mental acuity and emotional resilience. Her report would be crucial evidence in court, but more than that, her validation helped restore confidence that had been shaken by months of psychological manipulation. The most delicate aspect of our preparation involved Marcus. He was living with Stephanie, trying to act normal while secretly documenting her activities and protecting his own assets. The strain was enormous, and I worried constantly about his safety and emotional well-being. She knows something has changed, he told me during one of our careful phone conversations. She's been watching me constantly, going through my things, questioning every phone call and every absence. Last night, she accused me of conspiring against her. Are you safe? I asked, genuinely concerned that Stephanie might become physically dangerous as her situation became more desperate. I think so, Marcus replied, but uncertainty colored his voice. She's not violent, but she's definitely becoming more erratic. She's been making phone calls at all hours, and I think she's trying to find some kind of leverage or alternative plan. Gerald had advised Marcus to move out of their shared apartment, but we all agreed that might tip Stephanie off to the full extent of what we knew. Instead, Marcus had quietly secured his personal assets and important documents while maintaining the appearance of normal married life. As the court date approached, Patricia uncovered another crucial piece of information. Stephanie had been in contact with a private investigator of her own, someone who specialized in what he euphemistically called reputation management and asset recovery services. The investigator had been tasked with finding compromising information about me, my finances, or my family that could be used to support Stephanie's claims of incompetence. This actually works in our favor, Patricia explained. The fact that she hired someone to manufacture evidence against you demonstrates the premeditated nature of her scheme. It's going to be very difficult for her to claim this is legitimate concern for your welfare when she's actively working to fabricate proof of your incompetence. The week before the hearing, Stephanie made her final desperate play. She called Marcus at work, hysterical and claiming that I had threatened her during a phone conversation. According to her story, I had called her late at night, ranting incoherently about conspiracies and threatening to have her arrested on false charges. Marcus, who had been prepared for something like this, calmly asked her to provide details about the alleged call. When she couldn't give specific information about what I had supposedly said, he suggested they report the incident to the police together. Stephanie immediately backed down, claiming she didn't want to cause trouble for a confused elderly woman, but the damage was done. Marcus now had evidence that she was willing to fabricate incidents to support her case against me. The night before the court hearing, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, I had been a grieving widow trying to maintain a relationship with my son and his new wife. I had been naive about Stephanie's motivations and unprepared for the sophistication of her manipulation. But I had also discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed. I had learned to trust my instincts, to seek help from professionals, and to fight for my rights and independence. More importantly, I had learned that being older didn't make me powerless, and that experience and determination could be formidable weapons against those who would try to exploit perceived weakness. The courthouse was an imposing stone building downtown, its classical architecture suggesting the weight and permanence of justice. I arrived early with Gerald, dressed in my best suit and carrying myself with all the dignity I could muster. Patricia was already there, along with David Hartwell, who had flown in to testify on my behalf. Stephanie arrived with her attorney, a young man who looked increasingly uncomfortable as he reviewed the evidence Gerald had provided. She was dressed conservatively, playing the role of the concerned daughter-in-law, but I could see the tension in her posture and the calculation in her eyes as she surveyed the courtroom. Marcus sat in the gallery behind me, his face drawn but determined. We had agreed that he wouldn't testify unless absolutely necessary, as his testimony could be seen as biased, but his presence was moral support that I desperately needed. Judge Elizabeth Morrison was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had a reputation for being thorough and fair, but also intolerant of frivolous litigation and courtroom manipulation. Stephanie's attorney presented their case first, painting a picture of an elderly woman who had become paranoid and irrational following a health scare. He claimed I was making poor financial decisions, isolating myself from family members who were trying to help, and demonstrating the kind of declining judgment that required protective intervention. Mrs. Mitchell has become convinced that her daughter-in-law is involved in some kind of elaborate conspiracy against her, the attorney argued. She has hired private investigators, changed her estate planning documents multiple times, and has begun making accusations against family members that have no basis in reality. It was a skillful presentation that took kernels of truth and twisted them to support a false narrative. Yes, I had hired investigators and updated my legal documents, but those were rational responses to genuine threats, not evidence of paranoid delusion. When it was Gerald's turn, he methodically dismantled Stephanie's case piece by piece. He presented Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation, my medical records, and testimony from my financial advisors. He showed the court documentation of my rational decision-making and my proactive approach to protecting my assets. But the real devastation came when Gerald began presenting evidence of Stephanie's criminal background and her pattern of elder abuse. The courtroom fell silent as he displayed photographs, financial records, and testimony from her previous victims. "Your Honor," Gerald said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "this is not a case of family members concerned about an elderly relative's welfare. This is a case of systematic financial predation by someone who has made a career of targeting and exploiting vulnerable older adults." David Hartwell's testimony was particularly powerful. He spoke quietly but clearly about how Stephanie had manipulated him, isolated him from his family, and systematically gained control of his finances. His account of her sudden disappearance when legal pressure mounted was devastating to any claim that her motivations were benevolent. "She told me that my daughter was only interested in my money," David testified. "She convinced me that my family didn't really care about me, that I needed someone who understood my situation. It took months after she left for me to realize how completely she had manipulated my emotions and compromised my judgment." When Patricia took the stand to present her investigative findings, the full scope of Stephanie's criminal enterprise became clear. The courtroom heard about multiple victims across multiple states, about systematic financial exploitation, and about a carefully planned campaign to gain control of my assets through psychological manipulation and legal coercion. Mrs. Stephanie Mitchell's petition for guardianship, Patricia testified, represents the culmination of a 2-year plan to gain control of Mrs. Corey Mitchell's substantial assets. The evidence shows that she specifically targeted Marcus Mitchell because of his family's financial status, and that she has been working systematically to undermine Mrs. Mitchell's confidence and independence. Quote, Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted. When Stephanie's attorney tried to object or challenge the relevance of her past relationships, the judge overruled him sharply. "The pattern of behavior is clearly relevant to the credibility of the petitioner's claims," Judge Morrison stated. "The court needs to understand the motivations behind this petition and whether it represents genuine concern or something else entirely." The final blow came when Gerald presented the recorded conversation from Stephanie's visit to my house, where she had explicitly stated her plans to have me declared incompetent and had revealed her detailed knowledge of my financial situation. Her own words condemned her completely. "I've been planning this for 2 years," her recorded voice filled the courtroom. "I know everything about your finances, your health, your weaknesses. I know exactly how to make a case that you're incompetent to manage your own affairs." The silence that followed was profound. Even Stephanie's attorney seemed stunned by the implications of what the court had just heard. When Judge Morrison called for closing arguments, Gerald's presentation was masterful. He summarized the evidence systematically, showing how Stephanie's petition was not just frivolous, but actively fraudulent. He demonstrated that I was not only competent, but had shown exceptional judgment in recognizing and responding to the threat against me. "Your Honor," Gerald concluded, "Mrs. Corey Mitchell is not the victim of declining mental capacity. She is the intended victim of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Her recognition of that threat and her proactive response to protect herself demonstrate exactly the kind of sound judgment that this court exists to protect, not to override." Stephanie's attorney's closing argument was brief and unconvincing. He tried to suggest that the evidence of her past behavior was irrelevant, and that the court should focus only on my current capacity. But the damage was too extensive and too well documented to overcome. Judge Morrison retired to consider her decision, but she returned within 30 minutes, a remarkably short deliberation that suggested the evidence had been overwhelming. "In the matter of the petition for guardianship of Corey Mitchell," Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the full authority of the court, "this court finds that the petition is not only without merit, but appears to have been filed in bad faith as part of a broader scheme to defraud the proposed ward." She looked directly at Stephanie as she continued. "The evidence presented demonstrates that Mrs. Corey Mitchell is fully competent to manage her own affairs, and that the concerns raised by the petitioner are not based on genuine observations of declining capacity, but rather on a calculated attempt to gain control of Mrs. Mitchell's assets through legal manipulation." The judge's words fell like hammer blows. Furthermore, This court finds that the petitioner has engaged in a pattern of elder abuse and financial exploitation that raises serious questions about her motivations and credibility. The petition is hereby denied with prejudice, and this court is referring the matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of possible criminal charges. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Additionally, this court is issuing a restraining order prohibiting the petitioner from having any contact with Mrs. Mitchell or from making any further legal filings related to her competency or financial affairs without prior court approval. The gavel came down with finality, and suddenly it was over. 6 months of fear, manipulation, and psychological warfare had ended with complete vindication. I felt tears of relief and triumph streaming down my face as Gerald squeezed my hand and Patricia smiled with satisfaction. Stephanie sat frozen in her chair, her face pale with shock and defeat. Her attorney was already gathering his papers, clearly eager to distance himself from a case that had become a catastrophic ethical and legal disaster. As we left the courtroom, I saw Marcus waiting in the hallway. His face was a mixture of relief, sadness, and something that looked like liberation. "Mom," he said, embracing me tightly. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't see what she was doing. I'm sorry I didn't protect you." "You did protect me," I assured him. "When it mattered most, you chose the right side. That's all that counts." The criminal charges followed quickly. Within a week, Stephanie was arrested on multiple felony counts, including elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud. The evidence was so extensive that her public defender immediately began exploring plea bargain options. Marcus filed for divorce the same day, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking to protect himself from any financial liability for her crimes. The marriage that had begun with such hope and promise ended with legal documents and criminal proceedings. The ripple effects extended far beyond our immediate situation. Law enforcement agencies in 3 states coordinated their investigations, and additional victims came forward once news of Stephanie's arrest became public. The case became a model for prosecutors dealing with elder financial abuse, and Patricia's investigative work was cited in training materials for law enforcement agencies. David Hartwell recovered most of his stolen money through civil proceedings, and more importantly, he reconciled with his daughter, who had been trying to protect him all along. The other victims also found some measure of justice and closure, knowing that their abuser would finally face consequences for her actions. For me, the victory was both personal and profound. I had not only protected my assets and independence, but had also discovered capabilities and strengths I hadn't known I possessed. The experience had been terrifying and exhausting, but it had also been empowering in ways I couldn't have imagined. In the months that followed, I became an advocate for elder rights and financial protection. I spoke at senior centers and community organizations about recognizing the signs of financial abuse and manipulation. Gerald and I worked together to develop educational materials about estate planning and asset protection for older adults. Patricia's investigation business expanded significantly as word spread about her success in exposing Stephanie's criminal enterprise. She specialized increasingly in elder abuse cases, helping families protect their vulnerable members from predators and scam artists. Marcus struggled with the aftermath of his marriage's collapse, but he also grew stronger and more independent as he processed what had happened to him. He entered therapy to deal with the psychological manipulation he had experienced, and to understand how he had been victimized along with me. "I keep thinking about all the warning signs I missed," he told me during one of our long conversations several months after the court hearing. "But I think I was so eager to be in love, so ready to start a family, that I ignored my instincts." "That's what predators count on," I replied. "They exploit our best impulses, our desire to love and trust and build relationships. The fact that you're capable of those feelings isn't a weakness, Marcus. It's what makes you human." 6 months after Stephanie's conviction and sentencing to 4 years in prison, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Stephanie's mother, a tired-looking woman in her 60s who had driven 3 hours to speak with me. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said when I reluctantly agreed to see her, "I wanted to apologize for what my daughter did to you and your family. I also wanted you to know that I had no idea about any of this until she was arrested." She sat in my living room, the same room where so many confrontations had taken place, and told me about raising a daughter who had always been manipulative and self-centered, but who had hidden the full extent of her criminal behavior from her own family. "I keep wondering if there was something I could have done differently," she said, tears in her eyes. "Some way I could have prevented her from becoming the person she became." "You're not responsible for her choices," I told her gently. "She's an adult who made deliberate decisions to hurt other people. That's on her, not on you." Before she left, Stephanie's mother handed me an envelope. "She asked me to give this to you. I don't know what it says, and honestly, I'm not sure you should read it. But she said it was important." After she left, I sat staring at the envelope for a long time. Part of me was curious about what Stephanie might have to say now that her schemes had failed, and she was facing the consequences of her actions. But another part of me wanted no further contact with her, no additional manipulation or attempts to justify her behavior. Finally, I opened the envelope and read the single page of handwritten text inside. "Mrs. Mitchell," the letter began, "I know you have no reason to believe anything I say, but I want you to know that I never intended for things to go as far as they did. When I first met Marcus, I was genuinely attracted to him, and I thought maybe I could have a normal relationship for once." The letter continued with what appeared to be an attempt at explanation, if not exactly an apology. Stephanie described a childhood of poverty and neglect, a series of failed relationships, and a gradual descent into the manipulation and exploitation of others as a survival strategy. "I know that doesn't excuse what I did to you or to David or to the others," she wrote. "But I want you to understand that I didn't start out planning to become the person I became. It happened gradually, one compromise at a time, until I couldn't see any other way to live." The letter ended with something that might have been genuine remorse. "You were stronger than I expected, and smarter than I gave you credit for. In a different life, I think I would have liked to know you as a person rather than as a target. I hope you can find some peace knowing that you stopped me from hurting anyone else." I read the letter twice, then filed it away with the other documents from the case. Whether Stephanie's expressions of regret were genuine or just another form of manipulation, I would probably never know. But it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she could no longer hurt me or anyone else. A year after the court hearing, I hosted a dinner party for all the people who had helped me through the crisis. Gerald, Patricia, Dr. Chen, David Hartwell, and several other friends gathered around my dining room table for an evening of celebration and reflection. "You know," Patricia said as we shared dessert and coffee, "this case changed how I think about elder abuse. It's not just about protecting vulnerable people from predators. It's about recognizing that age doesn't automatically make someone vulnerable, and that experience and wisdom can be powerful weapons against manipulation." David nodded in agreement. "Stephanie underestimated all of us. She saw our age as weakness, but she didn't account for our lifetime of experience dealing with difficult people and complicated situations." As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and completeness. I had faced the greatest challenge of my later life, and had not only survived but prevailed. More importantly, I had discovered that the person I had become over 7 decades of living was more than capable of protecting herself and fighting for what mattered most. Marcus, who had been quiet through much of the evening, approached me as I was cleaning up in the kitchen. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking about something Dr. Chen said during her testimony. She talked about how recognizing manipulation and responding appropriately actually demonstrated your mental acuity rather than any kind of decline." "That's right," I agreed. She said that falling for Stephanie's schemes would have been evidence of impaired judgment, not the other way around. Marcus smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a completely genuine expression of happiness. "I think I'm finally understanding that I wasn't weak or stupid for being manipulated. I was just inexperienced with that level of calculated deception." "Exactly," I confirmed. "And now you'll never be that inexperienced again." As I prepared for bed that night, I looked around my house, the house that Stephanie had tried so hard to take from me, and felt profound gratitude for everything I had preserved and protected. But more than that, I felt gratitude for everything I had learned about myself and my own capabilities. At 73, I had discovered that I was far from the helpless elderly woman Stephanie had assumed me to be. I was a formidable opponent when threatened, a loving mother when my family needed protection, and a valuable member of my community when others faced similar challenges. The woman who had once insulted me by saying I smelled like death had learned that while I might be getting older, I was very much alive, very much capable, and very much unwilling to be anyone's victim. In trying to make my life smell like bankruptcy and defeat, she had instead discovered that I had the resources, intelligence, and determination to make her own life smell like the criminal consequences she had so richly deserved. Standing in my bedroom, looking out at the gardens that Robert and I had planted together decades ago, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since before Stephanie had entered our lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight I was exactly where I belonged, in my own home, surrounded by the life I had built, protected by the strength I had discovered, and ready for whatever the future might hold. 2 years had passed since Stephanie's conviction, and my life had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. The house that had once been the center of a bitter battle for control had become a sanctuary of peace and purpose. I woke each morning to the sound of birds in the oak tree outside my bedroom window, the same tree Robert and I had planted when Marcus was still in elementary school. The kitchen, where so many tense conversations had unfolded, now bustled with activity as I prepared meals for the monthly support group meetings I hosted for elder abuse survivors. What had started as an informal gathering of 3 people had grown into a network of nearly 30 individuals who had faced various forms of financial manipulation, family exploitation, and psychological abuse. Margaret, my friend who had first encouraged me to take a more aggressive stance against Stephanie, had become my co-facilitator for these meetings. Her own experience with manipulative adult children had given her insights that complemented my newfound expertise in recognizing and combating systematic elder abuse. "You know, Corey," Margaret said one afternoon as we prepared materials for that evening's meeting, "I never would have imagined that Stephanie's attack on you would end up helping so many other people." She was referring to the advocacy work that had evolved from my court case. Gerald and I had developed a comprehensive guide to protecting elderly adults from financial manipulation, which was now being used by senior centers and legal aid organizations across the state. Patricia's investigative techniques had been incorporated into training programs for law enforcement officers and social workers who dealt with elder abuse cases. The ripple effects had been remarkable. David Hartwell had established a foundation dedicated to helping elderly victims of financial fraud recover their assets and rebuild their lives. 2 of Stephanie's other victims had become speakers at conferences about elder abuse prevention. Even Marcus had found purpose in his painful experience, volunteering with organizations that helped families recognize and address manipulation within their own relationships. But perhaps the most unexpected development had been the relationship that had grown between Marcus and David Hartwell. They had connected initially through their shared experience of being manipulated by Stephanie, but their friendship had deepened into something resembling a father-son bond that neither of them had expected. "David understands what I went through in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't experienced that level of psychological manipulation," Marcus had told me during one of our weekly dinners. "He doesn't judge me for falling for her act, and he doesn't make me feel weak for not recognizing the signs earlier." Marcus had thrived in the aftermath of his divorce. The therapy he'd undertaken had not only helped him process the trauma of his marriage, but had also given him tools for recognizing healthy versus manipulative behavior in relationships. He had started dating again, cautiously but with much better judgment about the character and motivations of potential partners. His career had also flourished, as he'd applied the analytical skills he'd developed during our fight against Stephanie to his accounting work. He'd specialized in forensic accounting, helping businesses and individuals identify financial irregularities and potential fraud. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that Stephanie's attempt to exploit his family had ultimately led him to become an expert in the very crimes she had committed. The legal aftermath of Stephanie's case had been more extensive than any of us had anticipated. Her conviction had opened the door for federal authorities to investigate what they suspected was a broader network of individuals engaged in similar schemes. Patricia had been contracted by the FBI to consult on several related cases, and her expertise in elder fraud investigation had made her one of the most sought-after private investigators in the region. Gerald had also benefited professionally from our case, though that had never been his motivation for taking such aggressive action on my behalf. His expertise in elder law and asset protection had made him a recognized authority in the field, and he frequently testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger protections against financial abuse of the elderly. The Stephanie Mitchell case has become a textbook example of how sophisticated these schemes can be, Gerald explained during one of our regular check-ins about ongoing legal matters. But it's also become a model for how victims can fight back effectively when they have the right support and resources. The financial impact of our victory had been significant as well. Not only had I successfully protected my assets from Stephanie's schemes, but the civil judgments against her had resulted in substantial monetary awards for her victims. While Stephanie herself had few assets to satisfy these judgments, the case had established important legal precedents that made it easier for other victims to pursue recovery through various victim compensation programs. My own financial situation had actually improved during the 2 years since the court case. The investments that Robert had made years earlier continued to perform well, and the money I'd spent on legal fees and investigative services had proven to be the best investment I'd ever made. More importantly, the asset protection strategies Gerald had implemented meant that my wealth was now virtually immune to the kind of manipulation Stephanie had attempted. But the most valuable outcome had been the relationships that had developed through our shared experience. The support group that met in my dining room had become more than just a gathering of abuse survivors. It had evolved into a chosen family of individuals who understood each other's experiences and were committed to preventing others from suffering similar victimization. Elena Rodriguez, a 78-year-old retired teacher, had been financially exploited by her nephew and his girlfriend who had convinced her to give them power of attorney and then systematically drained her savings account. Frank Thompson, a widower in his early 80s, had been romanced by a woman 30 years younger who had disappeared with his credit cards and jewelry after convincing him to add her to his bank accounts. Each member of our group had a story of betrayal and manipulation, but they also had stories of survival, recovery, and hard-won wisdom. Together, we had created a network of mutual support that had helped everyone heal from their individual traumas, while also working to prevent similar crimes against others. The monthly meetings followed a structured format that had evolved over time. We began with updates on legal proceedings, recovery efforts, and personal milestones. Then we reviewed new cases that had come to our attention, discussing warning signs and red flags that might help others avoid similar victimization. Finally, we planned advocacy activities and educational outreach efforts. One particularly memorable meeting had focused on a case that Patricia had brought to our attention. A woman in her 70s was being pressured by her daughter-in-law to sign over her house and move into nursing care, despite being in excellent health and fully competent to live independently. The situation was remarkably similar to what I had experienced with Stephanie, but the victim was feeling isolated and uncertain about whether her concerns were justified. "This is exactly why we do this work," I had told the group that evening. "Not everyone has the resources and support system that I was fortunate enough to have. We need to be that support system for people who are facing these situations alone." Our group had rallied around this woman, connecting her with legal resources, helping her document the manipulation she was experiencing, and providing emotional support as she navigated the difficult process of confronting family members who were exploiting her. The case had been resolved successfully, with the daughter-in-law backing down once she realized the victim had professional support and legal representation. These success stories had become the fuel that drove our advocacy efforts. Each person we helped, each case we resolved, each family we educated about warning signs, represented a victory against the kind of predatory behavior that had nearly destroyed my own life. The educational workshops we conducted had become increasingly popular and sophisticated. Margaret and I had developed a comprehensive curriculum that covered financial protection strategies, legal remedies, psychological manipulation techniques, and family communication skills. We presented these workshops at senior centers, community organizations, religious institutions, and professional conferences. One of our most effective presentation techniques involved role-playing scenarios where participants could practice recognizing and responding to manipulative behavior. We had found that many elderly adults intellectually understood the concept of financial abuse but had difficulty recognizing it when it was happening to them, particularly when it involved family members or romantic partners. The emotional component is what makes these crimes so effective, I would explain during our workshops. Predators don't just target our money. They target our emotions, our relationships, and our fundamental need to trust and be loved. The workshops had also revealed how widespread elder abuse actually was. Nearly every session included participants who shared their own experiences with financial manipulation, family exploitation, or romantic fraud. Many of these individuals had never reported their experiences to authorities or even discussed them with friends and family members. There's so much shame associated with being victimized this way, Elena had observed during one of our support group meetings. People feel like they should have been smarter, should have seen the signs, should have been less trusting. But that shame is exactly what allows these crimes to continue. Our work had gradually expanded beyond direct victim support to include policy advocacy and legislative reform. Gerald had connected us with state legislators who were working on bills to strengthen penalties for elder abuse and improve legal protections for elderly adults. We had testified at committee hearings, provided input on draft legislation, and helped lawmakers understand the real-world impact of financial crimes against the elderly. One particularly significant legislative victory had been a bill that required mandatory reporting of suspected elder abuse by financial institutions, healthcare providers, and legal professionals. The legislation had been inspired partly by our case, where multiple professionals had noticed warning signs of Stephanie's manipulation, but had not been required to report their concerns to authorities. If the bank that handled my accounts had been required to report the suspicious transfers Stephanie was making, David Hartwell had testified during one legislative hearing, I might have been protected before she could steal $50,000 from me. The professional relationships that had developed through our advocacy work had also created opportunities for ongoing education and improvement in how elder abuse cases were handled. Patricia regularly consulted with law enforcement agencies about investigation techniques, while Gerald had become a resource for other attorneys handling similar cases. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated my competence during the court proceedings, had maintained contact with our group and had helped us develop psychological assessment tools that could be used to document the mental health impact of financial abuse. Her research had shown that victims of elder financial abuse often suffered from symptoms similar to those experienced by victims of domestic violence, including depression, anxiety, social isolation, and post-traumatic stress. The psychological impact of these crimes is often more devastating than the financial impact, Dr. Chen had explained during one of her presentations to our group. Victims lose not just money, but trust, self-confidence, and faith in their ability to make good decisions. This understanding had led us to incorporate mental health support into our victim assistance efforts. We had developed partnerships with therapists who specialized in trauma recovery and had created support protocols that addressed both the practical and emotional needs of abuse survivors. The third anniversary of my court victory had been marked by a celebration that brought together everyone who had been involved in the case and its aftermath. The gathering had taken place in my backyard, where Robert and I had once dreamed of hosting family celebrations that never quite materialized the way we had imagined. But this celebration had been everything we could have hoped for. David Hartwell and his daughter had attended, their relationship fully healed from the damage Stephanie had caused. Marcus had brought his new girlfriend, Sarah, a social worker who shared his commitment to helping vulnerable populations. Patricia and Gerald had been there with their families, along with Dr. Chen and several members of our support group. As I had looked around at the faces gathered in my garden, I had been struck by the realization that Stephanie's attempt to isolate and exploit me had instead led to the creation of an extended family bound together by shared purpose and mutual support. Her crimes had backfired spectacularly, creating not victims but advocates, not isolation but community, not weakness but strength. Judge Morrison had attended the celebration as well, something that had surprised and delighted everyone. She had rarely socialized with parties involved in her cases, but our situation had been exceptional in many ways. Mrs. Mitchell, she had said during her remarks to the group, your case taught me something important about the difference between vulnerability and victimization. You were never vulnerable in the way Stephanie assumed you were. You were simply unprepared for the level of calculated manipulation you were facing. Once you understood what was happening, you proved to be more than capable of protecting yourself and fighting back. The judge's words had resonated with everyone present, particularly the other abuse survivors who had struggled with feelings of shame and self-blame about their own victimization. As the celebration had wound down and guests had begun to leave, Marcus had approached me with something he wanted to discuss privately. "Mom," he had said, "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately, and I keep wondering what he would think about everything that's happened." It was a question I had pondered many times over the previous 3 years. Robert had been a gentle man who avoided conflict whenever possible, and I had sometimes wondered whether he would have approved of the aggressive tactics we had used against Stephanie. "I think," I had told Marcus, "that your father would be proud of how we protected our family and helped other families protect themselves. He always believed in standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult." Marcus had nodded, then surprised me with his next comment. "I think he would also be proud of who you've become through all of this. You were always strong, but you've discovered strengths you didn't know you had." As I reflected on Marcus's words in the weeks that followed, I realized he was right. The experience with Stephanie had been traumatic and frightening, but it had also been transformative. I had discovered capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, developed relationships I couldn't have imagined, and found a sense of purpose that had given new meaning to my later years. The woman who had once worried about being a burden on her family had become a resource for families facing similar challenges. The elderly widow who had seemed like an easy target for financial manipulation had become a formidable advocate for elder rights and protection. Most importantly, I had learned that aging didn't have to mean accepting vulnerability or relinquishing control over my own life. With the right knowledge, resources, and support systems, older adults could be just as capable of protecting themselves and fighting back against those who would exploit them as anyone else. The irony of Stephanie's attack on me had become increasingly clear over time. In trying to convince others that I was incompetent and helpless, she had forced me to prove exactly the opposite. In attempting to isolate me from support systems, she had led me to build stronger and more extensive networks than I had ever had before. In seeking to exploit my perceived weaknesses, she had helped me discover strengths I hadn't known existed. The woman who had once insulted me by saying I smelled like death had learned that while I might be getting older, I was very much alive, very much capable, and very much committed to using my remaining years to make a positive difference in the world. Her attempt to make my financial situation smell like bankruptcy had instead resulted in her own complete downfall and the creation of resources that would protect countless others from similar predation. As I sat in my garden on a peaceful spring morning, exactly 4 years after Robert's death and 3 years after Stephanie's conviction, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey I had traveled. It had not been the path I would have chosen, but it had led me to discoveries about myself and my capabilities that I might never have made otherwise. The flowers Robert and I had planted together continued to bloom each year, a reminder of the love and partnership that had sustained me through the early years of my widowhood. But now they were joined by new plantings that represented the relationships and purposes I had discovered in my later years, creating a garden that honored both my past and my present. The house that had once been the target of Stephanie's schemes had become a center of advocacy, education, and support for others facing similar challenges. The dining room, where so many confrontations had taken place, now hosted monthly gatherings of survivors who had transformed their own pain into purpose and power. And I, the woman who had once seemed like such an easy target for manipulation and exploitation, had become living proof that age could bring not just wisdom and experience, but the courage and determination to fight back against those who would prey upon perceived vulnerability. The battle with Stephanie was over, but the war against elder abuse continued, and I was no longer just a potential victim trying to protect herself. I was a warrior, armed with knowledge, surrounded by allies, and committed to ensuring that no one else would have to face alone the kind of systematic manipulation and exploitation that had nearly destroyed my own life. In the end, Stephanie's greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating my financial resources or legal connections. Her greatest mistake had been underestimating the power of a woman who had lived long enough to know her own worth, and who was willing to fight to protect not just herself, but everyone who came after her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, nearly 4 years after Stephanie's conviction. I recognized the prison postmark immediately, though I hadn't heard from her since that single letter her mother had delivered years earlier. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but something made me hesitate. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the advocate in me that had learned the importance of understanding the mindset of those who prey on the elderly. The handwriting was different from before, less confident and more shaky, as if written by someone whose circumstances had changed dramatically. I opened the envelope carefully and found 3 pages of cramped text that would provide insights I hadn't expected. "Mrs. Mitchell," the letter began, "I know you have every reason to ignore this letter, but I'm writing because my parole hearing is coming up next month, and I've been required to write letters of accountability to my victims as part of my rehabilitation program." She went on to describe her experience in prison, which had been far more difficult than she had anticipated. "I thought I was smart enough to manipulate the system here, the way I had manipulated people on the outside," she wrote. "But prison is full of people who are experts at manipulation, and I quickly learned that I wasn't as clever as I thought I was." The letter described a gradual process of self-examination that had been forced upon her by the structured environment of incarceration and mandatory therapy sessions. "For the first time in my adult life, I couldn't run away when things got uncomfortable. I couldn't find a new victim to exploit when my current situation became unsustainable. I had to actually face what I had become." What followed was the closest thing to a genuine apology I had ever received from her. "I understand now that what I did to you and to David and to the others wasn't just stealing money. I was stealing your sense of safety, your ability to trust, your confidence in your own judgment. I was taking away pieces of who you were as people, and I was doing it deliberately and systematically." She described the therapy sessions that had helped her understand the psychology behind her behavior. The therapist explained that I had been treating other people like objects to be used, rather than human beings with their own rights and feelings. She said I had developed what she called instrumental relationships, where I only valued people for what they could do for me. The most surprising part of the letter was her description of how she had learned about my advocacy work through other inmates who had elderly family members. "There's a woman here whose grandmother attended one of your workshops after her son tried to steal her Social Security checks. She said your presentation helped her grandmother recognize what was happening and get legal help." Stephanie went on to express something that seemed genuinely like remorse. "I know this doesn't change anything I did, but I want you to know that learning about the work you're doing has been part of my rehabilitation. Seeing how you turned what I did to you into something that helps other people has shown me what real strength looks like." The letter concluded with an unexpected request. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, because I know I don't deserve it. But I'm asking for your advice. When I get out of prison, I want to do something meaningful with the rest of my life. I want to find a way to make amends for the harm I've caused. Do you think there's any way someone like me could contribute to the work you're doing to protect elderly people from predators like I used to be?" I read the letter 3 times, my emotions shifting from skepticism to surprise to something approaching cautious hope. After 4 years of advocacy work, I had learned that rehabilitation was possible for some offenders, though it was relatively rare and required genuine commitment to change. I showed the letter to Patricia during our weekly coffee meeting, curious about her professional assessment of Stephanie's apparent transformation. "It's interesting," Patricia mused after reading it carefully. "The language is different from her previous communications. Less manipulative, more direct and honest. But of course, she could have learned to mimic the language of accountability without actually experiencing genuine change." We discussed the possibilities and risks of responding to Stephanie's letter. On one hand, engaging with her could provide valuable insights into the rehabilitation process and might offer opportunities to prevent recidivism. On the other hand, any contact with her carried the risk of renewed manipulation, even if it took different forms than before. Gerald's perspective was characteristically cautious, but thoughtful. If she's genuinely changed, ignoring her request for guidance could represent a missed opportunity to channel her knowledge of predatory behavior into prevention efforts, he said. But if she's still manipulative, any contact could be dangerous for you, and potentially for the people you're trying to protect. After considerable reflection and consultation with Dr. Chen about the psychological aspects of engaging with former abusers, I decided to respond to Stephanie's letter, but with strict boundaries and safeguards in place. My response was brief and direct. I acknowledged her apparent efforts at rehabilitation, while making it clear that trust would have to be earned through consistent actions over time. I explained that if she was genuinely committed to making amends, there might be opportunities for her to contribute to prevention efforts, but only under carefully controlled circumstances and with extensive oversight. The most valuable thing you could offer, I wrote, would be your insights into how predators identify and target victims. If you're truly committed to preventing others from following your path, you could help us understand the mindset and methods that allow these crimes to succeed. I also made it clear that any future contact would be contingent on her successful completion of parole and demonstration of genuine behavioral change through consistent actions over an extended period. The correspondence that followed over the next several months was unlike anything I had experienced in our previous interactions. Stephanie's letters were thoughtful and detailed, describing her understanding of the techniques she had used to manipulate her victims, and offering insights into the vulnerabilities that predators looked for in potential targets. I always looked for people who were recently widowed or divorced, she wrote in one letter. People who were lonely and eager for companionship were much easier to manipulate than those who had strong support systems. I also targeted people who seemed uncertain about their own judgment, particularly if they had recently experienced health problems or major life changes. Her descriptions of her methods were disturbing but also valuable for our educational efforts. She explained how she had researched her targets' financial situations, how she had gradually isolated them from family members and friends who might have questioned her motives, and how she had used emotional manipulation to make her victims feel dependent on her approval and support. The cruelest part, she admitted in one particularly candid letter, was that I would identify what each person needed most: love, companionship, validation, security, and then I would provide just enough of it to keep them attached to me while I worked to gain control over their resources. These insights proved invaluable for our prevention workshops. With Stephanie's permission, I began incorporating sanitized versions of her explanations into our educational materials, helping potential victims understand the sophisticated psychological techniques that predators used against them. The most significant development came 8 months after her initial letter, when Stephanie was released on parole and settled in a halfway house about 2 hours away from my city. She had found employment as a data entry clerk and was attending regular counseling sessions as required by her parole conditions. At her request, and with careful coordination with her parole officer, we arranged for her to participate in one of our educational workshops as a speaker who could provide the perspective of a reformed predator. The event was carefully structured to ensure that she had no direct contact with potential victims, and that her participation was clearly identified as part of her rehabilitation and restitution efforts. The workshop was one of the most powerful we had ever conducted. Stephanie's presentation was sobering and educational, providing insights into predatory behavior that no victim or professional could have offered. She described her techniques with clinical detachment, while expressing genuine remorse for the harm she had caused. I want everyone here to understand that people like I used to be are not obviously evil or dangerous, she told the audience. We're often charming, sympathetic, and skilled at making you feel special and cared for. That's what makes us dangerous. We use your best instincts, your desire to love and trust and help others, against you. The audience response was mixed, but generally positive. Many participants expressed appreciation for her honesty and for the unique perspective she provided. Some remained skeptical about her apparent transformation, which I considered a healthy response given their experiences with manipulation. Over the following year, Stephanie participated in several more educational events, always under careful supervision and with strict limitations on her interactions with potential victims. Her contributions became increasingly valuable as she developed better skills at explaining complex psychological manipulation techniques in ways that ordinary people could understand and recognize. The relationship that developed between us was unlike anything I could have imagined during the dark days of her campaign against me. It wasn't friendship. Too much damage had been done for that. But it was a functional partnership focused on preventing others from experiencing the kind of victimization she had perpetrated. I know I can never fully make up for what I did, she said during one of our carefully supervised meetings to plan educational materials. But if I can help even one person avoid being victimized the way I victimized you and the others, then maybe my life will have had some positive meaning after all. Her transformation, if genuine, represented something unprecedented in my experience with elder abuse cases. Most predators who were caught simply moved on to new locations and new victims. Very few underwent the kind of fundamental personality change that Stephanie appeared to have experienced. Dr. Chen, who had been monitoring Stephanie's progress as part of a research project on offender rehabilitation, was cautiously optimistic about her prospects for successful reintegration into society. The changes I'm seeing in her psychological profile are consistent with genuine rehabilitation rather than sophisticated manipulation, Dr. Chen told me during one of our consultations. But of course, the real test will be her behavior over the long term, particularly when she's no longer under the close supervision of the parole system. As I reflected on this unexpected development in my journey from victim to advocate, I realized that Stephanie's apparent transformation represented the ultimate validation of the work I had been doing. If someone who had been so thoroughly committed to exploiting and manipulating elderly people could genuinely change and contribute to prevention efforts, then perhaps there was hope for addressing the broader problem of elder abuse in ways I had never considered possible. The woman who had once tried to convince the world that I smelled like death had become, in her own complicated way, an ally in the fight to protect others from the kind of predatory behavior she had once embodied. It was a development that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of our conflict, but it represented the kind of transformation that could only emerge from a commitment to turning pain into purpose and victims into advocates. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.